April 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The symbolic heart of Hitler's regime prepared for a legendary resistance. German commanders fortified buildings, positioned their best troops, and prepared for a brutal siege that was supposed to last for weeks. They were ready for anything except for what actually happened. At dawn, General Patton's Third Army attacked, and the fortress crumbled. 5 days later, Nuremberg was American. Not weeks, not months. 5 days. The defenders, entrenched for a battle of attrition, could barely comprehend the speed of the collapse. Positions that were supposed to hold for a long time fell in a matter of hours. American tanks appeared in sectors the map said were impassable. Infantry attacked from directions military logic considered impossible. The German defense plan wasn't defeated. It became irrelevant before it was even fully executed. This is the story of how a general didn't just conquer a city, he broke his enemy's will to fight. Let's uncover the strategy behind this lightning attack. Nuremberg was not just another German city, it was a Nazi sanctuary. It was there that massive rallies hypnotized a nation, that torchlight parades illuminated the rise of a regime, and that the racial laws turned prejudice into state policy. Hitler had made this city the beating heart of his ideology. And now, in April of 1945, with Germany in ruins and the end approaching, Nazi propaganda promised a final glorious stand. Nuremberg, the cradle of the movement, would also be its heroic tomb. In command of the defense was General Karl von Holtz, a fanatic who saw surrender as a betrayal greater than death. For him, the city's destruction was preferable to the dishonor of surrendering it. His orders were clear and absolute. Fight to the last man, defend every street, every building. Any soldier who retreated would be executed. The defenses seemed to match his determination. Medieval walls that had withstood centuries of war were integrated with modern fortifications. Thousands of soldiers, including elite SS units who had sworn loyalty to Hitler until death, transformed the city into a fortress. Every window was a potential sniper's post, every corner a deadly trap. Von Holtz prepared his city for a specific type of battle, a methodical, slow, and bloody siege like the ones the Allies had waged in other cities. He expected days of artillery bombardment, followed by a cautious infantry advance, block by block. He would have time to move his reserves, to counterattack, to turn every street into a meat grinder. He made a miscalculation that would seal Nuremberg's fate. He had never faced a general like George S. Patton. On the other side of the front line, Patton did not see an impenetrable fortress. He saw a rigid, predictable, and psychologically fragile opponent. His plan was not to conquer the city, it was to break it. The strategy was one of brutal simplicity, overwhelming speed. Attack from multiple directions at once, giving the enemy no time to think, only to react. And by the time they reacted, it would already be too late. There would be no lengthy bombardments to announce where the main blow would fall. There would only be movement, relentless pressure, and chaos. Von Holtz's plan was perfect for the war he expected, but the war that was about to engulf Nuremberg would follow none of the rules he knew. The attack began in the icy silence before dawn on April 16th. The defenders of Nuremberg expected the deafening roar of a bombardment that would last for days, the traditional prelude to an assault. Instead, the American artillery spoke for only 30 minutes. It was a burst of concentrated violence, a swift and brutal blow designed not to announce the battle, but to stun the enemy in the first second. Long enough to force the defenders to take cover, but too short for their commanders to decipher where the main attack would come from. And then, amidst the confusion, the tanks advanced. They didn't come down the wide, predictable avenues where German anti-tank guns awaited them. They emerged from the unthinkable. Patton's combat engineers had worked through the night, turning the impossible into an attack route. They carved a path through the rubble of bombed-out buildings, crossed industrial yards, and used the chaos of destruction as a corridor. For a German defender, the experience was surreal and terrifying. Where there was once a factory wall, now there was a Sherman tank opening fire. The American infantry followed close behind, a wave that capitalized on the shock. While German garrisons wheeled around to face the tanks that had appeared at their rear, the infantrymen were already on their flanks, clearing positions before the defenders could understand what was happening. In less than 3 hours, the city's outer defenses, prepared for months, had been breached in multiple points. General von Holtz's command post was flooded by a deluge of contradictory and desperate reports. Americans in the northern sector, "We need reinforcements. A tank column has appeared in the industrial district. Where did they come from? We're cut off. Enemy infantry is behind our lines." Von Holtz desperately tried to maneuver his reserves, but it was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. By the time a reserve unit arrived to contain a penetration, the Americans were no longer there. They had already advanced to the next objective, creating a new crisis elsewhere. This was a lesson in psychological warfare, using speed to break an enemy's mind before breaking their battle lines. What other battle in history do you believe was won more by mental strategy than by brute force? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Your perspective is important, and to continue unraveling the tactics that shaped our world, only the chosen ones will click the red button to subscribe. The chaos that engulfed Nuremberg was not a side effect of Patton's plan. The chaos was the plan, and it was just beginning. What was happening in Nuremberg was not a conventional battle. It was the application of a brutally effective doctrine, the essence of Patton's philosophy, the war of tempo. The principle is simple to understand, but almost impossible to fight. Move faster than the enemy can think. Attack the next objective before he has finished organizing the defense of the previous one. Create chaos faster than he can restore order. Imagine a German commander receiving a report about an attack. While he analyzes the map to send reinforcements, a new report arrives. The Americans have already taken the next objective. The first report became obsolete before he could act. His decision cycle was broken. Now multiply that paralysis throughout the entire chain of command. The result is disintegration. The German soldier on the front line was not a coward. He fought with the ferocity of despair, but he was alone. The telephone lines were cut. The radio was silent. The reinforcements he expected never arrived. He fought a private war, isolated in his small stretch of street, unaware that the larger battle had already moved far beyond him. The most fanatical units, like the Hitler Youth and the SS troops, fought to the death, just as von Holtz had expected. They turned basements and apartments into fortresses, selling their lives dearly. But their sacrifice was tactically useless. Patton wasted neither time nor men on frontal assaults against these pockets of resistance. His forces simply bypassed the strongpoints, like river water flowing around a large rock, and continued to advance, leaving the isolated fanatics to be mopped up later. The defenders' greatest strength became their greatest weakness. But what happens to courage when it has no purpose? When bravery becomes just a faster path to death? After just 2 days of combat, Patton shifted his focus. The objective was no longer merely geographic, it became psychological. He aimed for the spiritual heart of the regime, the Nazi Party rally grounds, the place where Hitler, before hundreds of thousands of followers, had proclaimed the glory of the 1,000-year Reich. Patton knew that planting the American flag on that ground, sacred to the Nazis, would be a blow to enemy morale more powerful than any bomb. He gave a clear order. He wanted his tanks at that site within 48 hours. But to deliver this symbolic blow, Patton's army would have to cross the oldest part of the city, a labyrinth of narrow medieval streets with stone buildings that offered perfect cover for ambushes. It was terrain designed to nullify the greatest American advantage, the speed of their tanks. The war of tempo was about to collide with a centuries-old stone trap. The old town of Nuremberg was a trap designed by history. Its narrow, winding streets, built centuries before the invention of tanks, were a nightmare for any armored commander. In other urban battles in Europe, such as in Aachen, American tank losses had been catastrophic. A single soldier hidden in a window with a Panzerfaust, a cheap and terribly effective anti-tank weapon, could destroy a 30-ton Sherman tank with a single shot. The German defenders knew this. They set up hundreds of ambushes, turning the old town into a calculated killing zone. They waited patiently, ready to make the Americans pay for every yard of their advance. Faced with this tactical challenge, Patton's solution was a denial of urban warfare itself. If the streets were deadly traps, then his forces would not use the streets. The order was as simple as it was insane: advance through the buildings. The focus of the battle shifted from tanks and infantry to combat engineers. These men, armed with explosives, became the new trailblazers. They didn't clear paths in the forest, but rather holes in centuries-old stone walls. A demolition charge would blow out the side of a building, and a Sherman tank would drive over the rubble of someone's living room, enter through the kitchen, and exit through the back wall into the courtyard, completely bypassing the street where German tank hunters waited in vain. For the German defender, the experience was psychologically devastating. He was in his perfect ambush position, hearing the sound of approaching tanks, but the sound was not coming from the expected direction. It came from behind, from the side, from within the city block itself. The war was happening outside the battlefield he had prepared. The carefully planned defenses became irrelevant. Meanwhile, American infantry used the same makeshift corridors, moving through courtyards and alleys, emerging behind German positions and neutralizing them with brutal efficiency. The German urban defense doctrine, based on channeling the enemy into kill zones, was useless against an adversary who refused to be channeled. On April 19th, the unlikely tactic paid off. The first American tanks broke through the medieval labyrinth and reached the stone expanse of the rally grounds. The place, designed by Albert Speer to intimidate the world with its monumental scale, was now silent and empty. American soldiers, covered in dust and exhausted, climbed onto the grandstand from which Hitler had given his speeches and posed for photos in front of the gigantic stone swastika that dominated the complex. The image was not just a victory photo. It was the visual epilogue of an ideology. Patton's Third Army stood on the sacred altar of Nazism. The symbolic heart of the Reich was dead. Now all that remained was to deal with the man who had sworn to defend it with his own life. While victory photos were being taken at the rally grounds, General Karl von Holtz was isolated in his bunker, facing a far more relentless enemy than American tanks: reality. His grandiose promises of turning Nuremberg into a German Stalingrad now rang hollow, even to him. He had sworn to defend every street, but the reports that arrived, when they arrived, confirmed that most of the city was already under enemy control. He had threatened to execute any soldier who retreated, but now he knew his troops were surrendering in droves or simply disappearing into the confusion, trading their uniforms for civilian clothes. The loyalty he demanded at gunpoint did not withstand the collapse of order. The day was April 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. Instead of sending a happy birthday message to his leader, von Holtz was drafting his own epitaph. His communication lines were cut, his reserve units had been destroyed or captured, and organized resistance no longer existed. To continue the fight was to order the sacrifice of more men for a cause that was already dead. For a fanatic, futility can be a crushing revelation. Faced with the choice between surrender, which he considered the ultimate dishonor, and death, he chose the only way out his ideology allowed. Karl von Holtz committed suicide. The commander's death, rather than inspiring an even fiercer resistance, had the opposite effect. It was like cutting off the head of the snake. Without a central leadership to give orders, the already fragmented German defense completely disintegrated. The battle for Nuremberg devolved into a series of isolated and meaningless clashes. Groups of soldiers hidden in basements or ruins continued to fight, some out of duty, others out of fear, but without any hope of changing the outcome. However, above the chaos of the collapsing city, a final bastion of defiance remained. The old Nuremberg castle, a stone fortress that had dominated the landscape for almost 1,000 years, became the final rallying point for the most determined defenders. A mixed force of regular Wehrmacht soldiers and SS fanatics entrenched themselves within its ancient walls. They knew they could not win. The battle was no longer for victory. It was for a final act of defiance, a final bloody statement that even in total defeat, they would not surrender. Against the final fortress of Nuremberg Castle, Patton applied the same philosophy he had used throughout the city: overwhelming force, and relentless speed. There would be no honorable siege or a long negotiation. American artillery punished the ancient walls for an hour, a concentrated bombardment to open breaches and shake the defenders. Immediately afterward, tanks and infantry attacked from multiple sides at once, denying the defenders the chance to concentrate their fire on a single point. Trapped, the German soldiers fought with the courage of despair. They held out for 6 hours, the longest defense of any position in the city, but the outcome was never in doubt. By nightfall on April 21st, silence fell over the castle. Nuremberg was secure. The battle was over, but Patton's war against time continued. With the end of the fighting, a new challenge arose, one that no planner had foreseen on such a scale: the problem of success. Thousands of German soldiers began to emerge from basements, sewers, and ruins, not to fight, but to surrender. These were not just exhausted soldiers. They were the remnants of a broken army. Old men and boys from the Volkssturm militia, some barely able to hold their rifles, handed over their weapons with relief. Career officers, men who had fought across all of Europe, surrendered their entire units, recognizing the futility of further bloodshed. The flow of prisoners was so great that it threatened to paralyze American logistics. Each prisoner needed to be disarmed, searched, fed, and transported, tasks that consumed precious men and resources. For any other general, this would have been the time to pause, consolidate gains, and organize the rear. But Patton saw any pause as a victory for the enemy. His solution was, as always, pragmatic and brutal. He ordered a minimal force to be assigned to guard the prisoners. The rest of his combat units were to continue advancing. The order was clear: win the war first, deal with the bureaucracy later. 5 days, from an all-out assault to the complete control of a fortress city. How was this possible? It was not luck. It was not a miracle. It was the calculated application of principles that exploited not only the enemy's tactical weaknesses, but also their psychological flaws. But what exactly were these principles? And how did they combine to create such a swift and decisive victory, changing the way urban warfare would be viewed forever? The fall of Nuremberg was not a singular event, but the convergence of several factors, all exploited by Patton with surgical precision. The first and most fundamental was the collapse of German morale. In April 1945, the German soldier was no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. Faith in the cause had evaporated, leaving only fear and duty. Patton did not create this weakness, but his strategy was designed to exploit it to the fullest. Upon this fragile psychological foundation, Patton applied the decisive factor: speed. The speed of the American advance not only broke the physical lines of defense, but also destroyed the Germans' command and control. Each unit was forced to fight its own war, blind and isolated, unaware of what was happening on the next block. The tactic of bypassing the strongest points of resistance, instead of attacking them head-on, turned the enemy's strength into weakness, leaving well-defended positions completely useless, like islands in an advancing river. The psychological impact of this was immense. Seeing American tanks in areas that were supposed to be secure spread panic faster than any radio bulletin. Rumors of collapse became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Meanwhile, the relentless American logistics machine ensured that its frontline troops never ran out of fuel or ammunition, maintaining a pressure that the defenders, with their broken supply lines, simply could not sustain. The combat itself was as fierce as in any other urban battle. Each building was taken with grenades and hand-to-hand combat. The crucial difference is that this intensity lasted for days, not months, because the Germans never had a chance to breathe, regroup, or stabilize a defensive line. The capture of Nuremberg was more than the conquest of territory. It was the destruction of a symbol. The images of American soldiers at the rally grounds were the visual proof that the Nazi ideology was dead and buried under the tracks of the tanks. Patton did not invent a new form of warfare. He took the classic principles of speed and aggression and applied them at a pace that his opponents could not match. Nuremberg prepared for a siege, but received a blitzkrieg from the army that had learned to surpass the blitzkrieg itself. Which aspect of Patton's strategy impressed you the most? The tactical audacity, the psychological warfare, or the relentless speed? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you appreciate analyses that go beyond the obvious, consider subscribing and liking the video. Your interaction helps us continue to bring you these stories. In 5 days, the Thousand-Year Reich, proclaimed with such arrogance on that very soil, was crushed in less than a week.